Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the international refugee system. What's the definition of refugee? How are refugees entitled to first world migrant status? How are they selected? And once they come to the West, how does it work out? So, and the extent to which the globalists, in conjunction with the Western governments, which of course are no longer sovereign, all the Western governments now are beholden to the globalist cabal, the extent to which these governments try and hide and conceal and obfuscate the numbers coming in, and where the people are coming from, and so on. Also, the claim that these are desperate refugees who've had their lives stolen from them, and it's only right that they should come to a rich country in the West. So let's have a look at all of that and see if we can make sense of it. Now, just looking at the numbers of say refugees that have come from places in Africa and elsewhere, and then looking at they started arriving sort of in the early 2000s, I guess. Although it's hard to get numbers from there. And again, the classification and definition of refugee has changed. I think it keeps changing with the sole purpose of concealing and obfuscating it. But just looking at the, so there's one part of Africa where about 50,000 refugees have come to Australia. Probably the majority of those are in Melbourne, but not all of them. Well, the biggest cohort, at least, of them are in Melbourne. Now, how are they working out, whether it be in Britain or Australia or Canada or something? Well, for the ones that arrived getting on for 20 years ago now, a little bit more than 20 years ago, and they've been arriving sort of in pretty decent numbers between the early 2000s and say 2015, that sort of range. It started to spike in 2008-9. And which is again when it really became fully evident the globalists had taken charge. Before then, it sort of appeared like the globalists were in control, but it was a little bit hard to see through the fog of things. But by that stage, it was quite clear the globalists were running things all across the Western world, United States included. Obama was a through and through globalist stooge, for example. But just looking at how these people, first, these 50,000 people from this part of Africa that are in Australia now, unemployment is a little bit over 90%. Now, if you look at the numbers, that means nearly all of the ones that have arrived early and since are unemployed. Now, what it seems to be is they're entitled to the full generous range of benefits and additional entitlements on top of others because they don't speak English as a first language and they're not white, which gives them then additional entitlements. Equally, they have an entire system, these particular group, aided and abetted by white taxpayer dollars and government operatives and so on, to assist them to exploit every government benefit that can be imagined, whether it's free housing or rental assistance or loans that they don't have to pay back, so they can, for example, go and buy a motor vehicle and just decide we're not going to pay back the loan and the government will pay it for them. And there's all little things like this that are collectively, you'd wonder why they would bother working. And there's a small number that do, but not very many. Somewhere around 8 or 9% are in some form of employment. It's not clear whether that's full-time employment or part-time, because they only have to work 1 hour a week to be classified as employed. So there's a number of NGOs that work with them and pay all their legal fees and so on, and they can work 1 hour a week for this NGO and then be classified as employed. So I would suggest that's probably where the employment's coming from, which is just, again, part of the wider scam. Now, it costs a vast amount of money to have these people in the community. And again, even the ones that are born in Australia or the West, they still are 75 to 80% unemployed, even when they're sort of in their late teens and early 20s. They're being gifted all sorts of affirmative action education courses, but they don't seem to bother to turn up, and so money is thrown at them, and it doesn't appear to be making the slightest bit of difference. They're not assimilating, they're not contributing, they're not productive members of the community or the economy at all. Quite the opposite. Now, when you look at the crime rates are through the roof. 6 to 7 times the crime rate and more in some enclaves than, say, white citizens. So clearly there's a problem. Why would you bring people like that into the first world? Now, the numbers hold pretty steady, whether it's in, again, Britain or Australia, for example. So this is not something that's unique to one society or to another. It's something that's unique to these people and their ability to fit in or not fit in, or contribute or not contribute. Now, how are these, how are these refugees selected? How do you define a refugee in a first world sort of context? Well, let's suppose in a first world country the economy is devastated. So people that are used to having houses and comfortable, then comfortable crime-free neighborhoods, and they're used to be able to go to work and have a job and do everything and raise a family and do all the things that that in a middle-class based first world country you take for granted. When you have that taken away from you, then for example through warfare or something like that, or whatever it is, but when you have that taken from you, that's those people will be looking for, well, I want that sort of lifestyle again. I'm prepared to work for it. I'll make sacrifice, do what I've got to do, but I just need to go somewhere where I can lead that sort of life, because that's what I'm used to. That's what my country was. And now there's certain merit in a refugee there, because you've had a lot of things taken from you, and that should be, as far as I can understand, an entitlement to be seen as a refugee. Let's have a look at these folks in Africa, though. Now, they all come from basket case, failed state, third world countries, where infant mortality is off the charts, crime is out of control, gangsters run the place, and so on. So these people have an annual income that's 1/20th what it would be in a first world country. So cost of living is cheaper. They live in what we would refer to as the most squalid of conditions, the grass huts and all that sort of stuff. The idea of going hungry is not an unusual factor there. Mismanagement, corruption, petty tribal warfare are just never ending, and so it's a difficult existence. But it's not a first world existence, far from it. It's a basket case, third world, failed state type existence. So when these people move from that to a United Nations, for example, United Nations refugee camp, then they have a degree of certainty in their lives that they may never have had or never have known. They've got clean drinking water supplied to them. They've got food 3 meals a day. They've got shelter. They've got toilets. There are central sort of halls and rooms they can go to which are conditioned. They get free medical and dental, and they get a whole lot. They get free clothing. They've never had it that good. That's as good as it's ever been in their lives, because they've never led a first world middle class lifestyle. Far from it. So why are those people then refugees entitled to go to a first world country? I don't see it. They can go to another third world country, or they can stay in the refugee camp until such a time as things settle down a bit in their home. But their hometown or home country has always been in a state of disarray. Wouldn't it be better to fix that rather than to send these people to a first world country? Now, these people, their assimilation and integration, and again, their contribution, as I mentioned at the top, is non-existent. But it's hard to see them as refugees. And if they are refugees, it's refugees to go to another more stable third world country. It's not a refugee to come to a first world country. That's not what they're used to. It's so far out of their scope of understanding that why would you send them to a first world country? They don't integrate. They're probably the most unproductive citizens you could possibly imagine. Maybe in 4 or 5 generations it'll be different, but the first generation local, but even ones that arrived as children aren't integrating, assimilating. The ones that are born in Australia aren't integrating and assimilating. You look at the crime rates of teenagers of these people, again, Australian born, and their criminal activity is through the roof. Why is that? Why is it so difficult for them to not commit crimes? Why is it so difficult for them not to go on these insane sprees of theft? I mean, but then you look at blacks in a city, United States, that have been in America for 300, 400 years, and they behave sort of the same way. So there's something about that area of the world where these people come from. But it gets bigger than this, because the Australian government from time to time says, "Look, we're going to cut back on migration. We've listened to the people. The people have spoken. We've listened to the people, and we're cutting back on migration." But really, they don't. They don't. Instead, what they do is they may cut back on headline migration, but they'll substantially increase chain migration or family migration, family reunion as it's called in Australia. So they'll increase that, but that's done quietly in background. The globalist media don't take them to task on it. So they if the headline number is 500,000 into Australia, for example, 500,000 people a year, they may cut back on one form of migration, but simply increase another. So the refugee places may be 20,000, for example. They say, well, we only get 20,000 refugees, but they're picking them from selecting the refugees from places that have got almost a zero chance of integration, assimilating, the least productive citizens that you could possibly find in the whole world, who are already in safe circumstances and who come from a basket case third world country that has known nothing but tribal warfare for centuries. Why would you even think about selecting somebody from there? They're illiterate in their own language. They're not even the best of what that country or place or region has to offer. So they'll increase the number of refugees, but also through sleight of hand say, well, 20,000, we'll bring in 20,000 refugees, but each one of those refugees has 3 or 4 dependents. So that 20,000 becomes 80,000 and so on. So they constantly play around with the numbers and the definitions, or they'll reclassify these refugees as students. And then bring them out under bullshit student visas. So the headline, 500,000 people, has to be that's what the globalists have budgeted. You must bring in 500,000 people, and they must be primarily illiterate peasants from the third world. So the government just jiggles the numbers and says, well, we'll do this in family reunion. We'll call them refugees. We'll call them students. So they just move the classifications around. And if the numbers, for example, in Australia, just to illustrate the point here, Australia did have a problem with illegal migration at one point. Boats coming from refugee camps around Asia and Indonesia and around those parts of the world. And it was quite a decent boat ride, but you'd find these heavily pregnant women would all hoping to get the anchor baby gig. Now the government did stop that from happening, but at the same time they lowered the bar for legal migration. So there was no net benefit to Australia. Instead of having people that could speak English, somewhat, modest beginner English, instead of having people that spoke that, they would just lower the bar so you didn't have to speak a word of English. So they still increased the amount of people coming in simply by lowering the bar, even though they'd stopped the illegal migration. So an illegal migration in Australia today is more things like visa overstays, and the main source of this is India and Pakistan. But there seems to be almost no will or commitment by the government to deport these people. Yet, if some white West European overstays the visa, then suddenly the government is all muscular and hairy-chested and tough, and no resources are spared in getting the the Irish engineer who's overstayed the visa and kicking him out. But for some reason they just can't find all these Indians and Africans and Pakistanis, and we just don't know. Nothing we can do, and so it's a very different scenario there in terms of if it's a brown person, but if it's a white person, suddenly again they're all tough and vigorous in evicting them. Now, when you look at the whole refugee process, it's completely been taken over by the globalist cabal and has been utterly and totally politicized. So people are selected on the basis of social power or ideological social power. So if you're a black person from a poor black country and so on, then you have the least, amongst the least social power in the world. So we're gonna send you to a rich white first world country because you're entitled to it because of social power or something like that. And so it's racked and shot through with insane ideology. But the end result is that through subterfuge and deceit, hundreds of thousands, millions of these people are being moved into the first world countries. And again, with unemployment rates of over 90% and crime rates that are through the roof, no country, unless it was truly insane, would pick these sort of folks. I believe that refugees, because they've been brought into the West under huge scam conditions and using scam reasoning and ideological insanity, they have to be I would argue they have to be included under the banner of illegal immigrants. Effectively, that's, I believe, what they are, and they must be the return to their country of origin. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.